Portuguese Diary 1 by Maurice Brinton. Evora is the heart of the Alentejo. The Alentejo is the heartland of the agrarian revolution. Footnote. This diary describes some experiences during August 1975. End footnote. The latifundia are vast and for decades have been neglected. The soil is dry and hard, and upon the soil grow olives and cork. Wheat and maize would also grow rapidly if it were plowed and watered, but this would interfere with the joys of hunting. It is here that the class struggle has erupted in one of its most advanced forms. The agricultural laborers have seized many of the large estates. In some, the former owners have fled, occasionally leaving, quote, managers, end quote, to defend their interests. In others, they have remained, seeking to repossess their property through the courts or through direct action. The balance of power varies from village to village, estate to estate. We sleep on the floor of a large, isolated farmhouse about 3 miles from town. Some 15 Portuguese comrades have been lodging there every night for several months. The farm has been expropriated by the local Institute for Agricultural Reorganization, IRA, in which libertarian revolutionaries work in uneasy alliance with the representatives of the Ministry of Agriculture and members of the local MFA, Movement of the Armed Forces. Their aim is to help the farm workers to solve some of their practical problems which immediately and inevitably crop up in the wake of occupations. The libertarians want to assist without substituting themselves for those they are seeking to help. It is an almost impossible task. The farm comprises a large communal living room in which meals are taken at daybreak or sundown. From it, passages lead to a number of communicating rooms, stripped of all furniture and fittings, except for mattresses strewn on the floor. There is running water and electricity. There is beer in the fridge, and bread and cheese are brought back from the town each day. There are also Sten guns amid the guitars. Dispossessed landlords have threatened to string the young revolutionaries up from the nearest lampposts at the opportune time, quote, when we return to power, end quote. Under such a threat, the wine tastes sweeter and life is lived to the full. On our first evening, we drive out in a jeep some 30 miles to Santana do Campo. The villagers have a problem. They want representatives of the IRA there, quote, to help them bring pressure on the government, end quote. Several farms were occupied in the morning. The owners have paid no wages for several weeks. 2 managers were locked up that afternoon to, quote, help the absentee landlord face up to his responsibilities, end quote. The people are gathered in the local school. 130 agricultural workers with their wives and kids and quite a number of old folk. As so often in the countryside, the school is the only public hall. The lights can be seen from a long way off. They illuminate rugged faces, as varied as their owners, and quite unlike the crude stereotyped models of the Maoist posers. The whole village has turned up to elect the council and to decide what to do with the 2 men incarcerated in the stable. Everyone knows everyone. Anyone over 16 can be nominated and can cast a vote. Little tickets are handed out. Some of the older women decline to take one. Anyone can write anyone else's name on the slip. The 8 people securing the highest number of votes will constitute the council. Speeches are unnecessary. It is in struggle over the last few months that credentials were earned. The selected names are read out by 4, quote, tellers, end quote, the tickets sorted into little piles. The new council has been elected. The main problem is then outlined to the visitors from the Evora IRA. 2 opinions emerge. A union representative urges caution. The Agricultural Workers Union is affiliated to Intersindical, the trade union federation dominated by the PCP, Portuguese Communist Party. The Minister of Agriculture, who is sympathetic to the party, must not be embarrassed. Others suggest a different course of action. Quote, give them no food or drink. Let the news out. The bank will cough up soon enough, end quote. No one discusses the Portuguese Communist Party or its politics as such. The two alternatives are mutually exclusive. The radical proposal secures a majority. The Czech materializes within 24 hours. New section. I don't know what you call that when there's like 3 stars between bodies of text. Like obviously when you're reading it intuitively, it's just like, oh, it's a new section. But what is it really called? That's the real philosophical conundrum that we need to get to the bottom of today. The following day, we set out in the Jeep, in the full heat of the early afternoon, to visit a big farm where the workers are reluctant to impose any kind of control on the owner. The farm, built in 1945, is beautifully laid out. The main buildings and barns are painted blue and white. Cows are grazing in the fields and watch us pass impassively. Only the turkeys noisily announce our arrival as the Jeep edges its way between them, raising a great cloud of dust. The farm workers are gathered in a large barn, 8 or 10 of them. Sitting on sacks of grain, talking heatedly, our party enters. 3 young agronomists from the Evora Institute for Agricultural Reorganization, with long hair and determined expressions, a young officer in uniform with even longer hair, and us 2 political tourists. An excited argument gets underway and lasts about an hour. The local MFA is keen to ensure that the workers elect a committee which would exercise some, quote, control, end quote, on the owner, and prevent him from doing, quote, economic sabotage, end quote, such as slaughtering cattle, disposing of his tractors, or selling the grain, instead of keeping it for sowing. The workers are not convinced. The farm is a, quote, model farm, end quote. The boss has maintained reasonable relations with his men, often working among them. The paternalism has had its effect. The men lack confidence. An old edentulous worker fiercely articulates their innermost fears. Quote, if we elect a committee, the boss will sack some of us. Work is hard to come by these days. If we make things difficult for him, will he continue to pay our wages? Come on, young man. Yes, you with the gun, answer us. Look at all the problems in the other farms in the area. End quote. It is strange to see this innate conservatism clash with the vision of the young revolutionaries. The visitors depart, mission unfulfilled. Later that afternoon, we go to another big farm, 35 miles away in the opposite direction. On the way, we pass through the whitewashed Alentejo villages, bespattered with red slogans. These villages are strongholds of the Communist Party of Portugal. The agricultural workers are natural, genuine, down-to-earth communists. They want to share and share alike. No one seeks individually to appropriate anything. The party calls itself communist. The workers vote for it. It's as simple and as complicated as that. The inability to read fosters and sustains a fierce radicalism. The workers are not confused by the torturous ambiguities of the politicians. The farm, near Oriola, is owned by an absentee Spanish landlord. The last 2 miles have been very rough track, which only the Jeep can cover. The workers have taken the farm over, despite the government's half-hearted undertakings not to allow the expropriation of foreign-owned properties. The men have had no pay for 10 weeks. There are big stocks of cork neatly piled up to be sold, but the lorry has been stolen. There are problems, too, with the vegetable produce. To be sold in the cities, refrigeration is needed. People are fed up with eating tomatoes. The Communist Party's solution to all these problems is simple, eminently, quote, practicable, end quote. All occupied farms should become state farms. The Ministry of Agriculture will eventually pay the wages. A state trust will be set up to buy the produce, provide the lorries, look after problems of distribution. The workers are tempted, but instinctively suspicious. They want to get together with other workers on other farms to discuss things with them, to create cooperatives, to deal directly with the population in the towns. Excuse me, I didn't realize my phone had its sound on. Come on, you little bastard. There we are. Alright. Back in business. Now you get to hear me shuffling around. Does that sound good? They distrust the parasitic officials sitting in their offices in faraway Lisbon. But they are desperately in need of money to buy shoes, shirts, soap, string, nails, and agricultural implements. The men who work the farm over the hill have a tractor which isn't being used full-time. Will the army please instruct them to release it for a while? A joint meeting is arranged to thrash things out. The Institute will try to arrange a bridging loan from the local bank. A lorry will be provided to take the cork into the town. Ad hoc solutions are improvised. The wolf is kept from the door for a short while. The Institute has done a job of first aid. Hope will survive a little longer. Amid the wasps, an old woman is washing her linen at the fountain. The crickets are chirping. The sky is unbelievably blue. The Second Congress of Revolutionary Councils of Workers, Soldiers, and Sailors, the CRTSM, was held on August 2nd and 3rd in 1975 in Lisbon's Technological Institute, a vast concrete building at the top of a hill. Posters announcing it, the best quote socialist in the best quote socialist realist end quote style, had broken out like a rash on the city's walls several days beforehand. Once the paste had dried, they ripped off easily to the delight of large contingents of revolutionary tourists in search of souvenirs. We attended the afternoon session on the second day. At the entrance, a vast display of duplicated literature distributed free. Posters are on sale, their price escalating rapidly as it becomes obvious that demand will exceed supply. The foyer is packed with young people. Most look like students, and a substantial portion are not from Portugal. One hears almost as much French and German as Portuguese. Young PRP, Revolutionary Proletarian Party, supporters answer questions. Few relate to work, its problems, its tyranny, its organization, its transcendence. Most are about Cuba or Chile or the political allegiances of this or that army commander. The answers stress Portuguese particularism. The army will be with the people. Otello, Saraiva de Carvalho, has made friendly noises about the PRP. We go up a flight of wide stone steps with impressive columns on either side. The meeting is due to start in a vast hall which has doubtless harbored many a degree-giving ceremony or governmental function. Row upon row of wooden chairs, about 600 people are present, the same mixture as before. Very few workers. Quite a number had apparently been there the previous day, but had not attended for a second dose. No readily identifiable sailors. Banners on the wall seek nostalgically to recapture the atmosphere and even the vocabulary of Petrograd 1917. Quote, Fora com al canalha, poder aquem trabalha. Out with the scum, power to the workers, long live the socialist revolution, end quote. In the haze of cigarette smoke, the leftists dream on. The Technological Institute is Smolny, the Lisnov shipyards, the Putilov plant. At the far end of the hall is an elevated platform on which a long table has been erected. Seated behind it, perhaps a dozen comrades, most of them bearded, two of them women. In front of the leaders are neat stacks of cyclo-styled notes. Slightly to one side of the high table, the television crews with their wires, floodgates, and other paraphernalia are busy creating images. The 1970s are here regardless. The afternoon session starts about an hour late. Several speeches from the platform, most of them lasting a half an hour or more, quote, various analyses, end quote, we are told, quote, of the current situation, end quote. No interruptions, no laughter, no protest, no cheers. A platform speaker succeeds platform speaker. The text of their, quote, contributions, end quote, already duplicated are handed out by stewards. Only one speaker elicits any enthusiasm, a soldier in civies. It transpires he is making a, quote, critical analysis, end quote, of a text recently issued by Copcom, the section of MFA devoted to internal security. Some of the formulations are being challenged in the best tradition of dialectical nitpicking. The legitimacy of that particular fount of revolutionary wisdom is not, however, being questioned. People quietly drift in and out through the proceedings. It is formal, well-behaved, self-disciplined, and incredibly dull, an exercise in, quote, revolutionary, end quote, masochism. It has upon it the hallmark of death, or rather of verbose stillbirth. The corridors outside are plastered with slogans. The revolution is suffocating under the written word. In the gents' toilets, amid the usual graffiti, a wit has scrawled, quote, PCO equals Joaquim Augustino, Primeiro Ciclista Portuguese. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Whatever. After 3 hours, we drift out. Near the exit, we pass a large notice board. On it are listed the workplaces, quote, represented, end quote, at the Congress. It looks impressive. Factories of all kinds, transport depots, shipyards, telephone exchanges, hospitals, banks, shops, offices, all the areas in modern society where people are exploited and oppressed. On direct inquiry, however, and after our refusal to accept evasive answers, it was admitted that although members or supporters of the PRP worked in these various places, very few were attending in a delegate capacity. The whole episode left an unpleasant flavor of manipulation. I doubt we will hear much more from the CRTSM. When the next upsurge develops, it will find different forms and a different and a different content. Guimarães is a small industrial town, some 40 miles north of Porto. The Salsabru textile factory there is typical of many in the region, reflecting many of the problems of Portuguese capitalism. The factory, which makes towels, was occupied on September 14, 1974, after it had been abandoned by its owner. Earlier in the year, the boss, who owned another factory in the town, had begun to move out the more modern dyeing equipment under pretext of repairs. He had also removed the lorry. 33 workers, 22 women, and 11 men had taken over the factory to preserve their livelihood and decided to continue production. They had to learn everything from scratch. They bought the cotton at local wholesale rates and sold directly to shopkeepers, to visitors, to political sympathizers, and even at the gates of local factories. To start with, they had sold part of the stocks to pay their own wages. They had received little help from the local textile and metalworkers sections of Intersyndical, which were dominated by the PCP. The party's support for self-managed units was highly selective. The Salsabru was not a unit of which the party approved. The workers had elected a committee of 7 which met almost daily. There were also fairly frequent assemblies grouping everyone in the factory. They all worked 48 hours a week. There had been a sustained attempt at equalizing earnings. The average was 127 escudos, just over £2 a day. The machine minders earned 190 escudos. The newly taken on apprentice, 70 escudos. The main theme discussed at recent General Assemblies had been whether to take on more labor. A factory considered a number of large, fairly dilapidated hangars adjoining one another, in one of which the looms were situated. The machines looked at least 30 years old and were noisy and dusty. There were cobwebs everywhere and little light filtered in. The first task of the socialist revolution would be a sustained attack on capitalist technology, but here there was scarcely funds enough for wages, let alone for modernizing the plant. In the adjoining rooms, women were checking the towels, folding them, packing them in plastic cases. The room was brighter, and they spoke to one another. I approached a woman in her 40s who had worked there for 50 years. What was now different? Quote, for one, end quote, she said, quote, there are no longer foremen breathing down your neck. There used to be 3 foremen in this room alone. We now decide the pace of our own work and no longer live in fear of displeasing someone. We run the place ourselves. If I want to go shopping one afternoon, or if one of the children is ill, we can consult together and have a little time off without loss of earnings. No one takes advantage. We know that our collective livelihood depends on producing a certain number of towels each month. End quote. Adversity has bred a firm solidarity. When earnings were low, the most needy had been provided for first. Everyone seemed aware of the other's problems. Recently, things had not been too bad. This year, for the first time ever, they had enjoyed a fortnight's holiday with pay. Their main complaints were about the way people deformed the meaning of what they were doing. Their wall posters showed an intense awareness of their own condition. There can be few factories in the world plastered with excerpts from Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts. They knew well enough that they were still wage slaves and that what was being self-managed was their own alienation. They worked harder now than they did before, but they had gained a confidence in themselves that they had not felt previously. They had held, quote, round table, end quote, discussions with representatives of other self-managed factories to establish links and to exchange both experiences and products. They'd even bartered shirts for towels. One of them told us with a twinkle in his eye. They had discovered a great deal about the functioning of capitalist society which would be of use to them, quote, when the real time came, end quote. They had also learned very quickly about the trade unions, which had refused to help them or had only damned them with faint praise. Above all, they had learned a lot about themselves. New section. The Communist Party headquarters in Famalicão, north of Porto, lies shattered. Before April 1974, it was widely believed by those in power that literacy bred subversion. There was only one place in the town where the wealthy could obtain secondary education, an expensive private school built solidly and set behind a row of tall trees. With the collapse of the Caetano regime, the building, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the building had been taken over by the local Communist Party cell. I couldn't help thinking what an ideal Stalinist redoubt it made, separated by its high walls from the bustle of the multitude, set on higher ground, its impressive drive redolent with respectability. From here the party had carried out its manipulation of local government, of trade union branches, of cooperatives, of the granting of agricultural credit. The reaction had been handed things on a plate. After an open-air meeting nearly early in August, a crowd protesting against the unrepresentative nature of several local bodies had set siege to the school and tried to burn it down. Party militants had fired from the upper windows, injuring 2 demonstrators. The MFA had arrived on the scene to, quote, restore order, end quote. Their fire had killed 2 more demonstrators. The MFA interventions in such episodes had, we are told, been interesting to watch. At times the soldiers would threaten the crowd with their weapons, turning their backs on the besieged Stalinists. On the other occasions, they would turn their backs to the crowd, confronting the party members with their guns. Attitudes had varied from locality to locality, regiment to regiment, moment to moment. As Famalicão, the soldiers at Famalicão, the soldiers had faced the crowd, seeking to restrain the crowd. After a siege of 48 hours, the local party stalwarts had been ordered by party headquarters in Lisbon to evacuate the premises. The army had then left almost immediately. During the whole siege, there had been no sign of working-class support in the town, not even a token strike. The institutions controlled by the party apparatus were empty shells. The party had no roots in real life. Popular anger had then erupted. The place looked as if it had been hit by a tornado. An overturned car, burnt out, lay grotesquely in the road outside. The drive was littered with charred papers, posters, party cards. A disconsolate leaflet announced a meeting that was never to take place. The MRPP, Maoist, issued a statement welcoming, quote, the people's retribution against the social fascists, end quote. It wasn't, however, as simple as that. The red flag had been burned. A Portuguese flag now stuck out provocatively from an attic window. Beneath it, a large inscription proclaimed, quote, building to be taken over for refugees from Angola, end quote. Portuguese Diary 2 by Maurice Brinton. April 19th, 1976. Radio Televisão Portuguese crew in a van is doing a program on the, quote, vision of socialism, end quote. It is stopping in the street at factory gates and markets, talking to people and recording their replies. It's a tight fit inside, 7 people and lots of equipment. We make for Barreiro, an industrial town across the river from Lisbon. Once there is no problem getting to the giant CUF chemical works. The sky is gray, part cloud, part smoke. The walls are gray too, but bespattered with the red of posters. The plant, the stacks, the water towers hovering above us look as if built in the last century. Long streets of hangars, stores, and sheds, many with broken windows. There is noise and rust, and the plaster is peeling off the front of many buildings. Heavy smells hang in the air. The road is in poor repair, and old-fashioned capitalism clearly cohabits with the new. We pace through mean little streets of minute, decrepit, terraced housing. Quote, sulfuric acid street, end quote. Quote, candle grease street, end quote. Capitalism even murders the imagination. The houses were built 6-7 decades ago, possibly more. People still live there, sort of. This is the heartland of the PCP, its ideological and physical domain. Its posters are everywhere. A gigantic PCP balloon is tied to a rope between 2 rooftops. Quote, unity with the MFA, end quote. Quote, vote PCP, end quote. The van stops, and the crew take up their positions near to a group of women of indeterminate age going in. They are not in the least shy and talk readily. Quote, socialism? Quote, a steady job. Quote, like this? End quote. No answer. A steady drizzle is falling. Quote, like this? End quote. The producer repeats. The women, sensing something strange, turn on him, abuse the television, and march off, their fists raised, shouting, quote, PCP, PCP. End quote. There are joyful moments, too. Walking along the Tagus waterfront, between the station and the Praça do Comércio, we stop in front of a particularly fine example of mural art, enormous, unforgettable, quote, socialist realism, end quote, at its hideous best. The reds and yellows are gaudy as usual, caricatures of real color. The oppressed have very square jaws, very short hair, enormous arms, a very determined look. The proletariat, as seen by the Malaise, is clearly more brawn than brain, the sort of animal any skillful Leninist could easily ride to the revolution. But the, quote, anarcho-cynical, as in cynical, but the, quote, anarcho-syndicalists, end quote, have been at work. Modern capitalism requires modern transport. The MRPP leader is calling for a cab. Another story about taxis. In Elvas in the east, some of the estates belonging to big landlords have been taken over by those who work them. The usual pattern is for the agricultural workers to occupy first and seek authority later from the local center of the IRA. One recent expropriated latifundista in Spanish also happened to own the biggest taxi business in town. His drivers disliked him heartily and were much impressed with the new goings-on in the cooperative, so they took over the taxis. But the cult of authority dies hard. The act had to be, quote, legitimized, end quote, entered, quote, into the books, end quote. So the cab drivers all turn up one morning at the IRA headquarters for a, quote, official, end quote, sanction. The Ministry of Agriculture has files on tenants, trees, touros, and technical aid, but nothing on how legally to appropriate a fleet of taxis. The revolution creates its own surrealist precedents. May Day, 1976. Top of the Avenida Almirante race in Lisbon. The demonstration called by Intersindical is marching past. Municipal workers in their Sunday best. Railway workers in serried ranks. Decorated lorries packed with agricultural workers carrying pitchforks. Occasional singing. Very occasional laughter. Sellers do a roaring trade in political stickers. Selling to those watching the procession stickers for the Association of Collectivized Farms, for the Housing Fund, for student or women's groups. School teachers, building workers, hospital workers chant, quote, Intersindical, Intersindical, end quote, as they pass 10 or 12 abreast. 20,000 people march by, apparently far fewer than last year. The traffic has prudently been stopped, although Portuguese motorists have learnt patience the hard way. It is a fine, warm day. Banners unbelievably still demand, quote, unity with the MFA, end quote. The very MFA which is now the main brake on the revolution. They also demand the right to full employment and vigilance against fascists. Do I sense a certain weariness? There is none of the exaltation of the euphoria of even a few months ago, as if people realized that it would take more than mural graffiti to bring down the walls of capital. The party is everywhere, though nowhere in its true garb. In the Association of University Professors, in the Association of Municipal Associations, the bank employees march by shouting, quote, no to reaction, end quote. One or two tenants' committees carry colorful banners demanding government loans. The two groups march next to each other. Someone should introduce them to one another. At the end of the procession, a mass of red flags and a few hundred very young people shouting raucously, quote, Unidad Sindical, end quote. One might be dreaming. They want the PCP and the PS, Socialist Party, to take power in order to expose them, and Intersindical, too, to form a government, quote, without generals or capitalists, end quote. Yes, the trots in their rightful place, at the tail end of a Stalinist demonstration. Solidarity, Volume 8, Issue 4, I think is what this says, July 1976.